Hello, and welcome to 21 and 21, a rapid-fire Q&A show filmed at Presidio Bitcoin. I'm Haley Berkoe, and today I'm speaking with Laolu, otherwise known as Roasbeef. He's a longtime Bitcoiner, the CTO and co-founder of Lightning Labs, and a lead developer for LND, one of the main Lightning implementations. Laolu, thank you for taking the hot seat today.
Yeah, no, good to be here. Yeah, I love San Francisco. I'm happy PV is here as well, so.
Well, I'm excited to finally have you on the show.
Yeah.
It's going to be a good one today.
Cool.
All right, so you know the drill. I'm going to click this button, and we're going to roll right into it.
Let's do it.
Okay, let's do it. Well, typically my first question is asking what brings people into Presidio Bitcoin, but you've been here many times.
Yeah.
What's your impression been so far?
Nothing. It's been dope. Because, when I first started in Bitcoin, it was actually in San Francisco, and we were sort of at, 20th Mission. We had a bunch of different meetups there as well. So it's always been sort of like a big developer hub. I think over the past, maybe post-COVID, kind of like shifted away to New York, Austin, other areas where I feel like PV is bringing it back, strong. I think the meetups are really great now. I think it's just nice to have like a home for Bitcoin developers. We had the hackathon the other week, super dope. And I think it's also great to like see new faces at the meetups as well. People getting it for the first time versus like, obviously I like to see people I've working with for several years, but it's nice to also have people coming in for the first time and actually experiencing Bitcoin, asking questions, and just learning generally. So
I'm glad you like it. So speaking of the hackathon, you were here. You got first place.
Yeah, it was nice.
Can you tell me a little bit more about your project?
Sure. Yeah. So I worked with engineers on our team, Jason Brill, and we sort of like had this like twofold project, right? The first part was sort of like extending a protocol called MCP, which is sort of like a way to like expose tools to agents, and the tools are sort of like it being able to like read a file, send an email, things that are like not just text based, basically, right? And historically, MCP today doesn't really have good tools for sort of like authentication and for payments as well. So you're kind of like working with authenticated server, and maybe the MCP server is doing something very expensive. You're not really being compensated for that, right? So first we took something called L42, something I made maybe like 5 years ago before this whole AI wave really began. Kind of like thinking about what the stuff could be, very sci-fi kind of a thing. We sort of like added L42 support to MCP itself, right? So this means that you can basically have like a paid tool, right? So maybe you can imagine something that's like a tool for like sending a text message or an email, basically things that actually cost real world utilization or resources. This lets you basically pay for that itself, right? And then we hook that up to another tool, sort of like that uses like agents, sort of kind of something that's like doing actions in a loop, just not a request response, to actually do sort of like automated fuzz testing, right? You'd give it a program, and then it would basically look at the program itself and try to figure out a way to sort of like effectively test it. It would write a test for that, compile that, run the test, then get feedback on the test, basically if it was good or bad, they had crashes, the code coverage, and then use that to basically optimize additional tests. We basically put those two together, and it's sort of like we call it like autonomous fuzzing league. It's kind of like this agentic sort of like open source security tool, basically, that you can use to sort of like improve your programs, because everyone's vibe coding and writing a bunch of code, but tests matter a lot, basically. And this is a way to sort of like square that and actually like have the agents also help you write the code, but then also test it and evaluate it and make it more secure as well.
Is there like a lot of fuzz testing that happens like right now in Bitcoin, or kind of how does that happen?
Yeah. No, there's a ton that happens right now in Bitcoin. And so there's like a few different groups. I think one of the developers is Bruno, a Brazilian developer, basically, where they're actually like running sort of like continuous fuzz testing on a bunch of different repos, like LND, LDK, Eclair, Bitcoin D, BCD, things like that as well. And they found some stuff recently. For example, typically it's things around maybe you're not parsing a PSPT properly, or like an invoice isn't formatted properly, and like the sort of like the worst case is sort of like something can crash, right? So for example, imagine like you can just crash an LND node or any other node. That's like a pretty bad vulnerability, because typically this stuff requires you to like react to like a force close or something like that itself. So I think it's definitely like one of the highest leverage security tools that we have here, because rather than like you writing a canned test, it's sort of able to figure out exactly with a bunch of random inputs, maybe it can run like millions of tests over a few days, basically, versus the developer in the loop. And so what we did was sort of like, in this case, the developer is still like writing the test themselves. We have the agent sort of write the test, basically, and then go back and forth using that system. So it's a bit more autonomous. You still have a human in the loop to decide, okay, well, is it a big security issue? How should I report it? Should we like negotiate, something around like an embargo about that as well? So humans are still in the loop. To me, this lets people sort of like scale out and sort of, do the high impact things, and then sort of like farm out whatever else to the agents on the side. So.
Very cool. Well, It's exciting to see. Yeah, it was fun to have like these live demos too, and have like vibe coding and AI make these presentations like pretty solid, assuming like a short period of time.
One other thing is like I actually made the slides using AI, right? So basically like, so I fed it like a README that we wrote that it generated from the different products, and maybe like a 2-sentence prompt. And I use like LaTeX, which is this sort of like markup language that, renders like PDF. You've seen any like sort of like white paper or something like that typically written in that. So I was able to like take all that stuff in and actually make slides as well too, which is pretty cool. Because I think the initial submission was at 5 p.m. and we finished the slides at 4:45. So it was like a tight thing. We had to like do like a little run through to make sure like we knew what was in the slide deck. But I think it's really cool how you can use these tools for testing documentation, presentations, all that other stuff around the humans for sort of like the taste and creativity. And at the end of the day, like the decisions of do I merge this thing or not, and what are we actually doing in the first place. So
very cool. I love that.
Yeah.
So what's your top focus right now at Lightning Labs?
Good question. Always like LND is always definitely, up there in terms of like probably, I think the big thing we're doing at LND right now is just sort of like making it, more stable and secure basically, because like, because we have a lot of users, like we spend a lot of time on just sort of like, maintenance, right? So people, maybe something's not working properly, maybe there's a key requirement, maybe there's some like very old technical debt. The big thing we're doing right now is just like improving the database system itself, because like now people have had, Lightning nodes for many, many years, basically. They have millions of payments, they've gone through, multiple soft forks, potentially even as well, and maybe more in the future. So I think that's a big sort of like focus ours to make sure that people can actually scale out LND properly within that domain. And then obviously we also have, we're working on Taproot Assets, basically sort of like the ability to have, stablecoin, channels basically, and use those to make transact. It was cool. Some people maybe saw the Stake and Shake announcement. And so there's a company they're working with, Speed, and they actually help to do the payment processing. And they have like a wallet. The wallet's like a proto wallet because like it sort of like has like a wrap stable coin that they made from somewhere else, but it's cool because you can see the user experience where one of our team members, Ryan, he basically paid for the burger in USDT, right? But then they actually got Bitcoin on the other end. So it's pretty cool because now like you can sort of like pick what currency you want to send to. So they're still receiving Bitcoin, but now people that maybe aren't as used to the space yet, or maybe they're like, digested some FUD from many years ago, they see, oh, I send $10, right? And then they see, okay, I got 10,000 Satoshis basically, which is pretty cool. It's also crazy that 1,000 Satoshis is nearly $1 these days, right? Like that's an interesting threshold to cross.
Where do you see Taproot Assets being in the next 3 to 5 years?
Great question. So I think the main thing that we care about is just sort of like, using this to allow like Lightning Network to basically be used more widely, basically more broadly, because people can sort of like pick exactly what they want to receive and send. And the cool thing is that like, you can receive and send different things, right? So I can send you Bitcoin and you receive a stable coin or the other way around as well, right? But like in a few years, I think like it'll be in many of these mobile wallets itself. I think beyond sort of like the main stablecoins, I think we'll see other like smaller fintechs and maybe like neobanks start to adopt it themselves, particularly in other countries where maybe they are still using a different currency other than the US dollar itself. I think there's also a number of other cool use cases that like around maybe things around like timestamping. So for example, you could do something like I can post every single release of LND into the system. People can use that to verify all the signatures, and I'll even have like a verifiable chain they can then use to actually verify each additional release as well. And one other thing that we're working on, in terms of scalability, we're working on also kind of like adding Starks to the protocol itself, right? To basically make it more secure, and that can also give you ways to do more expressive transfers and also add a degree of privacy as well, which would be really cool.
Very cool. Well, I was going to ask you later on about your opinion on stablecoins, maybe the role that they have in onboarding more people to Bitcoin. Maybe expand on that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, like, I would say my opinion has like progressed a lot over the past 10 years or so, basically. I think in like many others, I saw them as like something that was like a distraction or maybe like parasitic or like not something that, people really should be using. We should sort of like, go around them, stuff like that. But I think like I just started to come around to like a more pragmatist view, basically, in terms of like viewing this as like a stepping stone onto Bitcoin Lightning itself, right? Because I think what we saw, before like they were so popular, people sort of like use Bitcoin as the main vehicle between all these other exchanges and different alts, whatever else, right? And that was basically the main role it has. And over time, like that moved elsewhere basically because they just needed sort of like a vehicle to transmit value, right? They didn't necessarily need actual Bitcoin itself, right? But I think it's interesting because this lets people sort of like bring that back to Bitcoin. Number one, actually have some of the activity there. And I know there's some opinions on that. I think the main thing is it gives people like a gradual path of getting onto Bitcoin Lightning itself, right? For example, someone can have a wallet and maybe they start just storing like 80% in dollars, 20% in Bitcoin itself, right? But then that gives you also the ability to do that at 70-30 and then so forth. There's a little more of a gradual ramp there. And I think the interesting thing is, for example, if people on the core of the network don't actually need to update, right? So let's say people are adopting this thing at the edges and mobile wallets, things like that as well. They don't need to do anything. They'll see increased routing traffic basically. And the network will actually grow now, right? Because you can say generally, there's probably like a lot of supply on Lightning today that maybe is somewhat underutilized, right? Thousands of Bitcoin, maybe, a fifth of it gets used. And there's sort of like, there's definitely like hot spots in the network depending on what wallet you're using. Well, in this case, now they can actually generate more and more demand for payments at the edges, basically, right? And I think there's still, a bit of ways to go for people like, broadly accepting Bitcoin payments natively, basically. But I think it's like a stepping stone to there. Because, for example, so the company says, okay, well, maybe I'll start receiving the stablecoin, but then, they're talking about, can I receive 10%, in Bitcoin itself, right? And the cool way this works is that like they can do that with the same invoice format, basically, right? The invoice format is exactly the same, it's still in Satoshis, but just at the last hop, it depends on which channel it goes into. I think it's a really cool kind of like gradual path of getting more adoption onto Bitcoin and also lighting itself.
So I've heard you mention Satoshis a lot. You probably know where I'm going here. So there's a lot of talk of sats versus Bitcoin. Do you think that we should reframe the way we talk about fractions of Bitcoin?
Good question. Yeah, like I think from my experience, I think it's enough just to explain to people that you can buy a fraction of a Bitcoin, right? I think that was like, a big hang up because like, particularly now they look, it's like, oh, it's $100,000 or whatever else, right? Like, so I think like that's the main thing. Some people argue maybe there is like somewhat of a unit bias. I think some of the ETFs help with that because you can buy the ETF for like, what is it like, I bet maybe it's like $64 right now or something like that versus the 100K, but you're having kind of like the exact same exposure there. And I would say, I think people can try it out. I think it's like, I think in order for it to work properly, everyone needs to do it all at once. Because otherwise one app can do it, but then it's like, okay, well, I have 10,000 Bitcoin here and 10,000 Satoshis here. Like, and it's like, well, how much did you send? 10,000 Bitcoin. Really? You sent me 10,000 Bitcoin? Like, I want $10 kind of a thing, right? So I think it's like an interesting discussion to have around like things like unit bias or whatever else. But I think the difficulty is that like, unless you do it all at once, it'll be like massive confusion generally with exactly what is what in a sense. And maybe that can happen in a future day. Maybe the time for it has already passed, given like how broad adoption is today. And like, think about 10 years ago, think about where we are right now with, nation states, companies, people using for transacting, even just like where the price is, like, other, countries commenting it and stuff like that. Like, we're definitely in an interesting space right now, I'd say.
I agree with you that, it needs to kind of happen all at once. Or, there's already confusion now I've heard of people like in Fountain, like, they have Bitcoin, but then they're spending sats. And it's like, is this another type of cryptocurrency that I need? Or like, what is a Satoshi?
Yeah, no, it's definitely, maybe there's probably like a low hanging fruit in just in the way people display the decimal places. Or for example, you could do something where you always like have 8 digits. Right. And then you just have the decimal place, at some important place because like then you say, okay, well, there's always that 100 million Satoshis or whatever, but I can sort of like glance at it and know more easily what's going on. And I would say like, 1,000 Satoshis being nearly $1 just helps with mental math around like how much do I have, with what's currently the unit account people are using, more broadly. So, yeah. Yeah,
there's definitely like ways we can improve like the user experience, like in the app. So people just kind of like get used to this mindset shift of, they're being fractions of Bitcoin.
Exactly.
That's not very like clear right now. People think they can't afford to buy Bitcoin.
Yeah, it's interesting because like, you can't really do much with like 10 cents, right? But you can do a lot with like 10,000 Satoshis, 100,000 Satoshis basically, but then that's like 0.0001 Bitcoin, right? So I think it's around getting them to, okay, well, Bitcoin is so powerful that you can do a lot with a little bit of it, kind of a thing. So
totally.
Yeah.
So how did you become a Bitcoiner?
Good question. I heard about Bitcoin, I guess maybe it was like my freshman year of college or so, basically. But like, I didn't program or anything before college. Like, I just knew I wanted to like, do some computer science programming thing, basically. So I just didn't really understand it at all. Like, I think like a friend was like, oh, check out this white paper, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, what's a white paper? Like, I don't understand any of the terms in there around like signatures or things like that as well. But like, it kind of stuck in my mind because like, it felt like, how can something like this exist, basically, how it hasn't been shut down yet, basically, right? Because it seemed like if this thing is really real, then it can be powerful, right? And maybe it wasn't until maybe like 2 or maybe even 3 years later where I had a little bit more CS background under my belt, basically, and I was able to actually I think what I did, I looked at all the citations and I read every paper in the citations, right? And there was one paper in there, I think it was like, new direction of cryptography, like the original like Diffie-Hellman paper. And I was like, oh, okay, asymmetric cryptography, you can use this or whatever else. So I think I kind of like went from a bottom up perspective from the like CS and technical aspect of it, basically. And then I was like, okay, wow, this is actually really cool. And then I became that Bitcoin because I would use it on all my projects, in school. Like all my friends were like, oh, we're gonna do Bitcoin thing. I'm like, yeah, we're gonna do a Bitcoin thing, basically. And then kind of like went from there. And I was lucky enough to be able to do some internships in the Bay Area, and that's where I met a lot of the developers. For example, at the SF Bitcoin developer meetups Bay back in like 2013, 2014. That was like my intro into sort of like being able to talk with them because I was an IRC and like mailing list, but like being able to like talk about Bitcoin like we were doing in first right now is like a big difference in terms of like getting up to speed more easily and also just like thinking about collaborations. And I met for example, Elizabeth, my co-founder, I met her at a Bitcoin meetup, basically, right? So I think it all went back to the meetups. And that's why like I love them, just talking to people and seeing what kind of like cool things can result from them.
Yeah, in person is huge.
Yeah.
Even like I've been in the San Francisco for a long time, and like you've been here, and like not having like a space, it's harder to like meet up and share ideas. So
Exactly. Yeah.
I think Presidio Bitcoin is going to be big in that.
Yeah. No, it's there. I mean, great location. Look in the background. Right?
What is one of your dream projects that you would love to see somebody else build?
On Bitcoin or generally? Good question. Like, I think like some of it's kind of like out there, but I think any sort of like cross around like, you know, Stark's doing all proofs on Bitcoin is super interesting, basically. Sort of being allowing people to sort of like just verify a short, you know, short proof, maybe it's like 100 kilobytes, and actually be able to use that directly. Because I think like I think once you have that capability, it sort of like frees up a lot of like protocol design constraints, basically. Because typically, maybe I want to make sure that you know that something happened in the chain, basically, right? Typically, I need to have the entire chain, and I'm scanning every single block, which isn't very scalable from the point of view of like something running on your mobile phone, right? But if you can show me proof that this event happened in the past, basically, and you maybe give me additional details around exactly what the event was and the structure and things like that, I think that's like a super cool, project there generally. I think some of the post-quantum stuff is pretty interesting as well. Like, I think less from a point of view of like the popular thing around do we confiscate coins versus not. I think I'm more interested in sort of like the practical constraints of signature sizes, the impact in natural block download, performance implications of that as well. You know, will that lead inevitably to a block size increase if the signatures are 1 million or 1,000x, larger than what we have today, basically. And so I think that's kind of like an interesting form, and like, it'd be cool if someone just have like a side chain of that, or like whatever, Signet chain, whatever they're calling it, these days instead. So, yeah.
Very cool. So I know you play the saxophone. If you could jam with any jazz legend, who would it be?
Good question. I would have to say, I mean, obviously Charlie Parker, the dude that kind of like really started the whole, bebop thing. But in terms of someone like came in a little bit after them, I would say like Jackie McLean, someone that kind of like, was a protege of people in that era, but also like has this very, I think like, hard hitting style about him basically. Like, and you can also just like, I can hear a record and I'm like, I know that's him because he has a very unique sign, the way he like phrases it. It's like, it's kind of abrasive. It's kind of like in your face, but the energy is like, I think really dope. So yeah.
I also know that you like gadgets and cool backpacks and stuff.
Yeah.
What is your favorite gadget right now?
My favorite gadget right now is actually this.
I was gonna ask you about that. Yeah. Explain to our listeners what it is.
I don't know if they can see it, but like it's a ring watch, right? So it's like a Casio watch that they just shrunk down and made into a ring, right? So it tells time and everything. It tells the day. It has like a timer, dual time zone, things like that as well. Interesting because like I can like check time in different ways. Like subtly, I can do like this versus being like, like rolling up my sleeve basically. So yeah, that's like my current favorite gadget these days.
It's cool. We'll see if it catches on. Maybe it'll be like the new Apple Watch.
Yeah, no, I think it's dope. And just in terms of like other peripherals, like imagine I could have this that was like hooked to my keyboard, right? I can do like certain gestures with scrolling or something like that. I think that'd be like a pretty interesting interface. Yeah,
I like it. What do you think the best way is for companies to support the Bitcoin open source ecosystem? So obviously there's just like general funding, I guess. Like, I think that's one part. I think one part that maybe is a bit like under-recognized or underrated in terms of the impact is sort of like just having discussions around sort of like things people were thinking about building, maybe constraints with the way the software works today. Because I mean, otherwise, like I think like there's definitely a lot of ideas out there, and there's no sort of like developers that like maybe have their own pet idea basically that they're working on. But sometimes it feels like maybe there can be more concentrated impact, right? And more of that two-way conversation between companies and developers around sort of like making sure that they're aware of like what some of the constraints are and maybe what people are thinking about, product-wise. Otherwise, we have a ton of libraries. I think like capabilities are higher than ever in terms of like ease of getting started. Basically, all these libraries, all these wallets, whatever else. Sometimes I think like there is maybe like conversation around sort of the actual impact and the product constraints basically that people are going on. I think that would allow us to, the companies like it would allow us to sort of like drive development in a more like productive direction basically. That's actually solving certain pain points that people have. Trying to adopt people on Bitcoin, trying to build on Bitcoin, and so forth. And I know, like, developers that like work more close to the company, they're very aware of that. But I think maybe some people that are maybe further out in the open source sphere, it's easy to just get, sort of like a whole way you're working on your own pet project. That's cool and stuff like that too. But maybe there's like potential possibility for greater impact within the space itself. So, is that a matter of like these builders like better forming educations and documents that like work for companies or coming to speak with, or how can we facilitate these
good question. Yeah, it's definitely like a two-way thing. Probably there's maybe the initial thing is just like certain companies maybe like because I guess depending on the company, some companies like to be very sort of like closed with what they're working on. They're not really talking about it. Maybe they have some like, super secret R&D kind of a thing. And I know depending on the constraints of the product, but maybe it starts even there basically. People talking about more openly about like, things that they would like to build, or other constraints, or even like you're saying, like having like a developer or two that's sort of like very much into the product of what they're doing, that's still able to sort of like bridge the gap to the traditional open source community. They're posting on Delving and things like that as well too, while, the PMs can focus on the go-to-market and their strategy and things like that as well. So it's a little bit of that bridging. But I would say like that, I think has, changed, a lot in the past few years. And I think one company that does a pretty good job at it is someone like Block, that like has people that are working on the main product side of things. They're also trying to like, go into the future a little bit. And they have people that are bridging the gap working on these projects to like move that stuff forward a little bit. Also with the constraints of the user and the product in mind, because at the end of the day, like it needs to work. And even if the tech is really cool and there's cool cryptography or whatever else, it doesn't really matter if it's not really being used in people's hands, or it's not actually impacting Bitcoin users and people around the world. So yeah.
Interesting. Maybe we can try to facilitate this at Presidio Bitcoin somehow.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah.
I love the idea. Okay, a few more questions.
Cool.
What's happening today that gives you the most hope for Bitcoin's future?
Yeah. What's happening today? I would say, I guess it's twofold. Like I'm happy about it, but I'm also somewhat concerned. I think just general, the adoption. Right, the way things are right now, people knowing about Bitcoin, it not being like a shadowy dark net kind of a thing compared to it was a while ago. So I think that's like amazing. Sometimes like it feels like, okay, well, is the adoption moving too quickly? Right. For example, like do we actually have the proper tools in Bitcoin today to actually make sure that we can make things secure, decentralized, promote self custody, and so forth? Right, because you can say, well, could we have done something around like covenant introspection many years ago? Versus it now being this like hot topic where in the current state of it, because like the people involved, people maybe we don't even know some of the actors that are at play, maybe it's potential that like things just get stalled, right? And they get stalled to the point where we don't actually necessarily have the tools to defend against the future adversaries, basically, right? So I think it's amazing that like things are getting more broadly, there's more adoption as well too, but do we actually have the tools to defend ourselves and the principles that we care about in Bitcoin? Because there's always lots of people to talk about, like there's a lot of conversations going on that on the peripheral, but like, what do we need to defend the core principles of the system itself? And I think some of those may have been certain upgrades to basically make self-custody applications just more easier to build, basically. And and also if we want to promote people actually holding their coins, they need additional capabilities, maybe sometimes even outside of like the wallet, the UI side of things in the system to make sure they can still secure their coins effectively. Maybe these are things like some of these reactive wallets. Maybe it's sort of like a two-factor system. Maybe there's some additional threshold. Basically, things that like can actually make self-custody easier now, because for many people they just view it as sort of like, okay, well, I lose my password and then it's just basically gone. And can we have additional steps there? And I know there's some things people are doing on the hardware and like the mobile wallet level as well too. But that's one thing where it's like, because I always think back to the quote from Satoshi where it's like, I think WikiLeaks started accept donations basically. And it's like, oh, we've kicked the hornet's nest. Right. And it feels like every few years we go on like a stair step where it's like, oh shit, oh. And then, it keeps going. But hey, it's still here at TikTok next block. Right. So that's still amazing. And that's why Bitcoin's so great.
Interesting. Last question. What advice would you give to people who are either new to the Bitcoin space or thinking about jumping in?
Good question. Yeah. I mean, I would say probably the biggest thing is just like somewhat engage with the community somehow. So I would say, like, I think compared to many years ago, it's a lot easier to get started. There's like, something called like Bitcoin search XYZ, where you can just like search on anything. It has like all the obscure mailing list posts and delving and things like that itself. So I would say the main thing is just like keep an open mind, like, learn from the community. There's great documentation out there. And then if you're looking to like get into like pick like a project that's somewhat constrained basically, and then, try to do that itself. And I think now with a lot of the AI tools and like research tools, things like that as well, it's easier than ever to get started. It's easier than ever to even make something or even sort of like, try to like have some contribution maybe on the intellectual philosophical level, even if you don't necessarily know things very well at a super low level, right? So I would say like, again, get with the community, go to a meetup depending on where you are in the world basically, and then just try to make something. And like, you can probably make something these days. Like from the hackathon, there were people there that like hadn't coded and they were able to make pretty compelling applications, which is pretty dope. So yeah, definitely opening up a lot of possibilities. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for hopping on the pod today. Thank you. Where can our listeners learn more about you, follow your work? So I'm Roasbeef, just about everything. That's ROASB, so Roasbeef, no T. And I'm on Twitter, I'm on GitHub, I'm on, I guess that's really it. So, and you can find my email from that as well. So, where did your nickname come from? I should have asked you that. I can ask you now. Maybe I'll put it in. Yeah, you can slice it in like the bonus credit. Yeah. So it came from sort of World of Warcraft actually. So I played it back in the day, and initially I was on private servers, right? And then like it was a thing, but then like Blizzard like shut them down basically. So I had to make like a real actual server. I was looking for names. I think like on that one I was like Loki or something like that. And I just got back from football practice. In Texas, like football is a big thing. And I had like my mom got me like Subway. Like I had a Subway club basically, right? So I was putting in a bunch of different names. All those were taken. I was like, oh, okay, well like this has like roast beef in it, right? Let me try that. And that was taken because the T was there. And I took out the T, and then from there on, it's never been taken. So it was just one of those things where roast beef wasn't taken. I think I liked it too, like just because it's like somewhat just whimsical. It's like roast beef. It's like, well, it's not like a serious like Elite Hacker 45 or something like that itself. I would just roast beef on like anything I did, from there until now, because I've been roast beef for many years now. Like so, yeah.
I love it. Do you still play World of Warcraft?
Not on like the actual version, but like I play some Diablo every now and then. Which is like a dungeon crawler version of that. But yeah, I don't play World of Warcraft like proper. Like I don't have room in my life for an MMORPG.
Yeah, it's a big time.
Yeah, I don't have. I would get sucked in. Like, like yes, like I'm like a min maxer optimizer, in those type of games. So like,
I've never played before, but I've heard it's like it's a lot of time.
Yeah, no, it gets like, guild leaders were like a full-time job basically around like handling the raids and things like that. And I think some people like, in the space started there because it taught them sort of like certain organizational skills around planning and feedback and coordination and things like that like you use like in an actual organization, engineering or even working across different community lines as well. So.
Well, thanks for coming on the pod.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It was a lot of fun.
Cool.
Yeah.